I knew something was wrong before I even turned onto my street. You ever get that feeling after a long day, when you're already running on fumes, and somehow your brain knows there's one more headache waiting for you at home? Yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. I'd just finished a 12-hour shift at a manufacturing plant outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio, and all I wanted was a hot shower, a microwave dinner, and maybe 20 minutes in my recliner before I fell asleep. Instead, as my truck rounded the corner, I saw a black Mercedes SUV parked directly across my driveway, again. Not near it, not partially blocking it, completely blocking it. Like somebody had looked at my driveway and thought, yep, that's where my vehicle belongs. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield, feeling my pulse start climbing. The funny thing is, if it had been the first time, maybe I would have laughed it off. Maybe I would have knocked on the door and figured it was an honest mistake. But this wasn't the first time. It wasn't the 10th time. It wasn't even the 20th. This had been going on for almost 6 months. The SUV belonged to my neighbor, Ryan Whitaker, a guy who moved into the neighborhood about a year earlier and somehow managed to act like he'd personally purchased the entire block. Ryan was one of those people who never technically broke the law badly enough to get in real trouble, but somehow made life miserable for everybody around him. His garage was stuffed floor to ceiling with expensive toys, motorcycles, jet skis, some vintage convertible he only drove on sunny weekends. His wife parked her luxury crossover in their driveway. Their college-age daughter had a sports coupe, and whenever they ran out of room, somehow my property became the overflow lot. At first I tried being reasonable. I walked over one Saturday morning with a cup of coffee in my hand and introduced myself. "Hey Ryan," I said, keeping it friendly. "Would you mind leaving my driveway clear? My mom lives with me, and sometimes she has trouble getting around." He smiled, nodded, and said, "Sure thing, neighbor." Then 3 days later his SUV was blocking it again. I left notes. I texted him after another neighbor gave me his number. I even called the city's non-emergency line twice. Every answer was the same. Civil dispute. Property disagreement. Not our problem. Ryan knew it too. That's what made it worse. Every time I'd bring it up, he'd give me this little grin, like a guy playing a private joke nobody else understood. One evening I got home and found him standing outside watering his lawn while his SUV blocked my driveway. I rolled down my window and said, "Seriously?" He shrugged. "It's only for a little while." I pointed toward the empty curb in front of his own house. "Then park there." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on, man. It's not that big a deal. Not that big a deal." I remember those exact words because they rattled around in my head for months afterward. See, maybe it wasn't a big deal to him. He wasn't the one parking 3 blocks away after working overtime. He wasn't the one carrying groceries through snowstorms. And he definitely wasn't the one watching an elderly parent struggle because someone else's convenience mattered more than basic respect. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in early October. My mother had gone grocery shopping while I was at work. She's 78 years old, stubborn as a mule, and refuses to ask for help unless she absolutely has to. When I got home, I found her sitting on the porch rubbing her knees. The Mercedes was there again. Bags of groceries were stacked beside her. "You okay?" I asked. She smiled the way parents do when they're trying not to worry their kids. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. She'd parked halfway down the block and carried everything back herself. 3 trips. Maybe 4. I looked down the street and saw Ryan standing in his driveway talking on his phone. He could see her. He had seen her the entire time. And he hadn't moved the vehicle. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not rage exactly. Not revenge. More like clarity. The kind that comes when you've spent months trying to solve a problem politely and suddenly realize the other person has no intention of meeting you halfway. That night, after Mom went to bed, I walked into the garage and started sorting through old boxes. Most of them had belonged to my grandfather, Harold Bennett. Grandpa had been a land surveyor for over 40 years. If there was one thing he loved more than fishing, it was paperwork. The man documented everything. Maps, property lines, old county records, easement agreements, notes scribbled in margins nobody else could read. Growing up, I used to joke that he trusted filing cabinets more than people. Around midnight, I found an old metal box covered in dust. Inside were dozens of folders organized by year. Most were probably worthless. Old tax documents, utility records, boundary surveys. Then I noticed a faded folder labeled North Ridge Access Corridor, 1964. I almost tossed it aside. Almost. Looking back now, that little decision changed everything. Because buried inside that folder was a piece of history nobody on our street remembered anymore. And once I started reading, I realized Ryan Whitaker had made a mistake far bigger than parking in front of my driveway. I stayed up until almost 3 in the morning reading every page in that folder. At first, none of it seemed particularly exciting. Survey maps, engineering sketches, correspondence between the county and several property owners from the 1960s. The kind of paperwork most people would throw away without a second glance. But Grandpa never threw anything away, and somewhere around page 32, I started noticing a pattern. The street where our neighborhood sat today hadn't always existed in its current form. Decades earlier, most of the land had belonged to a handful of farming families, including mine. Back then there were no subdivisions, no luxury homes, no landscaped entrances with decorative stone signs. Just open fields, dirt access roads, and a lot of stubborn people arguing about fences. When the county decided to develop the area, they needed access through several private parcels to build what eventually became North Ridge Lane. Most landowners sold outright. My grandfather didn't. Instead, he negotiated. And apparently he negotiated very, very well. The agreement wasn't a sale. It was an easement. The county received the right to build and maintain the roadway, but ownership of certain underlying portions remained tied to the original property. What caught my attention wasn't the easement itself. It was a section buried deep in the language labeled conditions of continued use. Legal documents aren't exactly thrilling reading, but one sentence practically jumped off the page. The easement could be challenged or modified if substantial commercial activity inconsistent with residential designation materially altered the intended use of the corridor. I read that line 5 times, then 10. Then I pulled out my phone and started searching county records. By sunrise, I wasn't sure what I had found, but I knew it was worth investigating. Friday after work, I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk probably thought I was crazy because I spent nearly 4 hours digging through archived documents. Most people only show up when they're buying property. I was looking for history, parcel maps, zoning amendments, recorded agreements, amendments to amendments. Every document seemed to confirm the same thing. The original easement still existed. The conditions still existed. Nobody had paid attention to them in decades because there had never been a reason to. Until now. The more I looked into Ryan Whitaker, the more interesting things became. Officially, he was a business consultant. That's what everybody knew. What nobody seemed to talk about was how much business he actually conducted from home. Clients arrived almost daily. Luxury sedans lined the street during meetings. Delivery vans came and went constantly. He had installed a detached office structure behind his house. Professional signage occasionally appeared near his front yard. On social media, he openly advertised executive consulting sessions hosted at his residence. His company website even listed his home address as a meeting location. Now, I'm not a lawyer. The last thing I wanted was to convince myself I discovered some magical loophole that didn't really exist. So I scheduled a consultation with a property attorney named Rebecca Collins. I carried 2 boxes of documents into her office on Saturday morning. She spent nearly an hour reviewing everything before finally leaning back in her chair. "Where exactly did you get all this?" she asked. "My grandfather never threw anything away." She laughed. "Well, your grandfather may have been the most organized man in Ohio." Then she got serious. Very serious. Rebecca explained that situations like this were extremely rare. Easements usually become routine. People stop thinking about them. Municipalities stop reviewing them. Property owners assume everything is permanent. But assumptions aren't always reality. "Can this actually be enforced?" I asked. She folded her hands. Potentially. Potentially. Not exactly a guarantee, but it was enough to keep going. Over the next week, we built a file. Business registrations, public advertisements, website screenshots, event listings, photographs of client vehicles, social media posts showing meetings hosted on-site. None of it was fabricated. None of it required tricks. Ryan had documented most of it himself because he was proud of his success. Every piece added another brick to the wall. Meanwhile, Ryan kept doing what Ryan always did. One afternoon, I came home and found his SUV blocking my driveway again. This time I simply parked elsewhere and walked past him. He smirked. "No speech today," he called out. I stopped, looked at him, smiled. "Not today." That seemed to bother him more than arguing ever had. The following Monday, Rebecca filed a formal petition requesting review of the easement conditions. We weren't asking for damages. We weren't demanding money. We were asking the county and the court to determine whether the original conditions had been violated. That's all. At least officially. Then things started moving faster than anyone expected. Apparently, once government attorneys began examining the original agreements, they discovered questions nobody had asked in 50 years. Surveyors were consulted. Planning officials became involved. Old records were pulled from storage. A process that should have taken months suddenly gained momentum because nobody wanted responsibility for ignoring a potentially enforceable property restriction. Ryan had no idea any of this was happening. For almost 2 weeks, life continued normally. His clients came and went. His vehicles occupied half the street. He walked around with the confidence of a man who had never experienced meaningful consequences. Then Wednesday arrived. I will never forget that Wednesday. I got home around 6 in the evening and noticed several county vehicles parked near the entrance to North Ridge Lane. Orange barriers sat along part of the roadway. Survey flags dotted the grass. Neighbors stood outside watching. Nobody seemed to know what was happening. Then I saw Ryan's Mercedes turning onto the street. He slowed, stopped, rolled down his window. One of the officials approached his vehicle and handed him a packet. I was too far away to hear the conversation, but I could see his expression changing as he read. Confusion first, then irritation, then something else, something closer to disbelief. He got out of the SUV and started talking rapidly, pointing at the road, pointing toward his house, pointing at the paperwork. Another official arrived, then a sheriff's deputy. Ryan's confidence evaporated right in front of everybody. It was like watching air leave a balloon. Within an hour, rumors were flying through the neighborhood. Some people thought a construction project had been canceled. Others believed there was a zoning dispute. By nightfall, the truth began spreading. Access rights affecting portions of the street were under legal challenge. Certain uses were being reviewed. Development permissions connected to future improvements had effectively frozen pending resolution. The practical implications were enormous. Refinancing became complicated. Planned property modifications stalled. Expansion permits were placed on hold. Nobody's home vanished overnight, despite what some neighbors later exaggerated, but uncertainty suddenly hovered over the entire corridor. And at the center of it stood Ryan Whitaker. The next morning, his attorney's SUV appeared outside his house. Then another. Then another. For 3 straight days, professionals came and went. Meetings stretched for hours. Tension practically radiated off the property. One evening, I stepped outside to collect my mail and found Ryan standing near the curb. He looked exhausted. Not angry. Exhausted. "Did you do this?" he asked quietly. For a moment, I considered dodging the question. Instead, I said, "I filed paperwork. Over a parking dispute." I almost laughed. "No, Ryan. The parking dispute is what made me start reading." He stared at me for several seconds. "This is insane." "Maybe," I said. But 6 months of blocking someone's driveway wasn't exactly normal either. He didn't answer. He just stood there watching me walk back toward my porch. For the first time since he'd moved into the neighborhood, he looked like a man realizing actions have a way of accumulating interest. And over the next few days, that interest was about to come due in a much bigger way than either of us had imagined. By the beginning of the second week, the entire neighborhood had become invested in the situation. People who normally barely waved at each other while collecting their mail were suddenly standing in small groups at the end of driveways comparing updates. Some thought I had gone too far. Others thought Ryan was finally experiencing consequences he'd avoided for years. What surprised me most wasn't the legal battle. It was how many stories started coming out once people realized someone had finally pushed back. One neighbor told me Ryan's clients routinely blocked her mailbox. Another said delivery trucks serving his business had damaged landscaping more than once. An older couple at the end of the street admitted they'd stopped inviting family over on weekends because parking had become such a headache. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who had spent months swallowing frustration just to keep the peace. Ryan's attorneys eventually reached out through Rebecca. The tone was completely different from the confidence we'd seen earlier. Suddenly, there were discussions about compromise, cooperation, and practical solutions. Funny how quickly attitudes change when expensive legal bills start arriving. A few days later, Ryan knocked on my door himself. Not the arrogant version I'd gotten used to. This was a different man entirely. Tired eyes, Wrinkled shirt. No smirk. No attitude. My mother happened to be sitting at the kitchen table when I opened the door. Ryan glanced past me and immediately looked uncomfortable. "Can we talk?" he asked. We sat on the porch for nearly an hour. He admitted his business had grown faster than expected. He admitted clients had become a constant presence. He admitted he'd ignored complaints because he honestly believed nobody could do anything about them. Then came the part that stuck with me. "I didn't think it mattered that much," he said. I looked toward my mother's car sitting safely in our driveway. "That's the problem," I replied. "You only measured the inconvenience from your side." For a while, neither of us said anything. The evening was quiet except for birds settling into trees and lawn sprinklers clicking in the distance. Finally, Ryan asked the question everybody had been wondering. What would it take to fix this? The answer wasn't money. It never had been. If this were about getting rich, I would have approached it differently from the start. What bothered me wasn't the vehicle. It was the disrespect. The assumption that someone else's property, time, and comfort mattered less than his convenience. So we negotiated conditions that actually addressed the problem. His business operations would move to a commercial office within a reasonable period. Visitor parking would no longer spill into neighboring properties. A formal access use agreement would establish responsibilities going forward. And most importantly, any future interference with my driveway would trigger immediate penalties under the agreement. Everything would be written. Everything would be enforceable. No handshakes. No promises. No misunderstandings. Ryan agreed to all of it. Frankly, he didn't have many alternatives. Within days, the paperwork was drafted. Attorneys reviewed every line. Signatures were collected. The dispute that had consumed weeks of legal attention finally moved toward resolution. As restrictions began lifting and uncertainty faded, life slowly returned to normal. The county closed its review. The neighborhood stopped gossiping. Contractors resumed projects that had been delayed. And for the first time in months, nobody parked in front of my driveway. Not once. Not accidentally. Not for 5 minutes. Not even partially. A few weeks later, I came home after another long shift and found my mother unloading groceries directly beside the front porch. No long walk. No struggling with heavy bags. No frustration. Just a simple moment most people would never think twice about. She looked up and smiled. "Nice having the driveway back, isn't it?" I laughed. "Yeah, turns out I was pretty attached to it." We carried the groceries inside together. That should probably be the end of the story. The hero wins. The neighbor learns a lesson. Everybody lives happily ever after. But real life rarely works that neatly. Because even now, years later, people still disagree about what happened. Some neighbors believe I did exactly what needed to be done. Others think I escalated a parking conflict into something far bigger than it should have become. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. The truth is, I still think about that sometimes. Could I have handled things differently? Probably. Could Ryan have avoided the entire situation by showing basic respect from the beginning? Absolutely. What I know for certain is this. Small acts of entitlement have a strange way of growing over time. People convince themselves that one blocked driveway isn't a big deal, one ignored request isn't a big deal, one little inconvenience doesn't matter. Then months pass, resentment builds, and eventually somebody reaches a breaking point. By then, the fight usually isn't about the original problem anymore. It's about everything that came before it. These days, Ryan and I are civil. We wave when we see each other. His business operates from an office downtown. My driveway stays clear. Life moves on. But every now and then I'll pull into my driveway after work, shut off the engine, and remember how close that entire neighborhood came to a very different outcome because one man decided somebody else's property didn't deserve respect. And that's the question I want to leave with you. If you were in my position, after 6 months of being ignored, dismissed, and disrespected, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have let it go? Was it justice? Or was it revenge dressed up as a legal solution? Let me know down in the comments because I've heard strong arguments from both sides, and honestly, even after all these years, I'm still curious where most people draw that line. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who has dealt with a difficult neighbor. And remember, sometimes the quietest person on the block is carrying a file cabinet full of history that nobody else bothered to read.